The signal had been running for 11 days. It came through the Galactic Accord's emergency frequency, a long broken cry from somewhere deep inside the Cassian Rift, that ugly stretch of space where magnetic storms chewed through sensor arrays like rust through old iron. The signal carried a name, the Sorrow of Stars, a Velthari colony ship, 460 people aboard, life support at 14%, hull integrity failing. The message looped every 6 hours, the same words, the same numbers, the same coordinates that no rescue fleet had moved toward yet. The Accord's 5 founding species had all heard it, every one of them. The Theran Directorate ran the numbers first. And their analysts sat in their silver-walled chambers and built probability models with the kind of calm precision that had made them the most admired scientists in the known galaxy. The Cassian Rift was a death corridor, electromagnetic shear that could tear navigation systems sideways, debris clouds that moved in patterns no mapping algorithm had ever fully cracked. Mission loss probability, 91.3%. The Theran Council reviewed the figure, voted formally, and declined. They filed the paperwork the same afternoon. Clean, correct, logical. The Saravi Collective did not decline. They deliberated. They formed an ethics committee, then a subcommittee, then requested that the subcommittee produce a report before any action was authorized. 3 days passed. The report was still being drafted. The signal kept looping. And the Mindari hegemony dispatched a probe, unmanned, highly sophisticated. It entered the rift and survived for 6 minutes and 14 seconds before the magnetic shear shredded its navigation core. The Mindari logged the probe as lost, updated their rift mapping data by a marginal amount, and returned to other business. The probe's last transmission was a stream of raw sensor data nobody had time to parse. The Olanthi went quiet, not an official refusal, not a statement, just silence, which in Olanthi diplomatic culture carried its own kind of answer. Day 4, the human frigate CSS Calliope picked up the signal. It was not a warship. It was not a rescue vessel by any formal classification. It was a mid-range resupply frigate, the kind of ship that spent most of its life moving food canisters and replacement parts between stations. Unremarkable in every technical sense, with a crew of 31 and a hull that had been patched in 11 different places since its last full service. Commander Diane Kowalski had been on her 3rd cup of coffee when the signal came through her comms officer's station. She set the cup down. She read the coordinates. She read the casualty count. She looked at the rift profile data on her secondary screen for about 45 seconds. Then she filed a mission request up the chain of command. The chain hesitated. It asked for a risk assessment. It asked for a probability breakdown. It asked her to wait for a formal Accord response before acting unilaterally on what might fall under collective jurisdiction. She waited 4 days. She read the same looping signal 400 and something more times. On day 12, she stopped waiting. The Calliope's course change was logged at 0340 station time. Navigator Cody Marsh plotted the entry vector into the rift while eating a granola bar, calm the way people get calm when they've already made their decision and stopped arguing with it. Marsh was 26 years old, grew up on the Georgia coast, and had a way of talking to the Calliope's navigation system like it was an elderly relative whose quirks he'd memorized and loved anyway. He patted the console once, quietly, before he locked in the heading. Chief Engineer Nora Patel was already in the lower decks when the course change registered. She had felt the ship begin to shift before the announcement came through. She always felt it. The way the engine tone changed when Kowalski made up her mind about something. Patel was 44 years old, second-generation Navy, and had the look of someone doing complex math in their head at all times. She pulled up her maintenance logs and started making a list of everything that would need reinforcing before they hit the rift's outer edge. The list was long. She started at the top. On the Accord's diplomatic observation station, a Theron official named Quell Saris watched the Calliope's trajectory appear on the shared navigation grid. He had been stationed here as an observer for 2 years. He had developed what he believed was a solid understanding of human behavior during that time. He stared at the trajectory line for a long moment, then turned to the human liaison seated across from him, a tired-looking man named Pete Greer, who was on his second plate of whatever passed for dinner in the station cafeteria. What are they expecting to find in there?" Quell Saris asked. Pete Greer looked up from his food. He thought about it for maybe half a second. "Survivors," he said. Quell Saris waited for the rest of the answer. There was no rest of the answer. Greer went back to eating. The Theron official turned back to the screen. The trajectory line was still there. One small ship heading into a corridor that his own civilization's fleet had declined to enter. He opened a new document and began writing notes, because Quell Saris was the kind of person who wrote things down when he did not understand them, on the theory that writing might eventually produce understanding. He wrote, "They appear to have run the same probability calculations we did. They reached the same number. They moved anyway." He stared at the sentence, and he did not know what to do with it. He left it there and kept writing. The Calliope crossed the rift boundary at 0712. The signal was still looping, 11 days, 9 hours, 42 minutes since the Sorrow of Stars first sent it. Kowalski stood at the front of the bridge and watched the electromagnetic readings climb on every screen around her. The rift didn't look like much from the outside, a darker patch of space, a slight visual shimmer where the magnetic fields bent light at the edges. It looked almost peaceful if you didn't know what was inside it. She knew what was inside it. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was tight. She had not slept more than 4 hours the night before, which was not unusual for her before a difficult entry. And she had already moved past the part of her brain that kept trying to remind her what 91.3% looked like as a number. That number lived in one room. She had walked into a different room. The door was closed. "Marsh," she said. "Ready," he said. He hadn't looked up. "Patel." Her voice came through the comm. "Already on it." Kowalski nodded once at nothing in particular. She looked at the shimmer at the edge of the rift. Somewhere inside that magnetic dark, 460 people had been waiting for 11 days. They had sent the same message over and over into the silence, not knowing if anyone was coming, maybe starting to believe that no one would. They were wrong about that. The Calliope moved forward. Quell Saris, still at his desk on the observation station. I watched the trajectory dot enter the rift boundary and disappear from the grid. The rift's electromagnetic interference swallowed the signal almost immediately. The dot was just gone. He sat with that for a moment. Then he wrote, "I do not know what they are." It was the first time he had written that sentence. It would not be the last. The Cassian Rift was not a place with rules. Everything else in space had rules. Gravity followed equations. Radiation moved in predictable waves. Even asteroid fields had patterns if you were patient enough to find them. The rift had none of that. It had magnetic shear that hit the ship sideways without warning, like a giant hand deciding to slap something it found annoying. It had debris clouds that drifted in directions no existing model had ever accurately predicted. It had old Accord mapping data that was worse than useless. Data that pointed the Calliope toward corridors that no longer existed, toward gaps that had closed months or years ago, toward clear paths that were actually walls of spinning metal. Cody Marsh threw the mapping data out in the first 20 minutes. He navigated by feel, by math he was doing in real time, and by numbers he wrote on his forearm in black marker because the navigation screens had started flickering in and out from the electromagnetic interference. His handwriting got smaller and tighter as the hours passed, cramming more calculations into the available space on his skin. He didn't complain about this. He didn't say much at all. He just worked. And when one set of numbers stopped making sense because the rift shifted again, he crossed them out and wrote new ones beside them. The Calliope lost its primary sensor array 40 minutes in. Nora Patel felt it go before the alarm sounded. A specific vibration in the hull that she recognized the way someone recognizes the sound of their own front door sticking. She was already moving down the maintenance corridor when the alert light came on. The sensor array housing had taken a magnetic surge that burned through 3 relay junctions simultaneously. Clean replacement was not an option. She pulled the junction panels open, looked at what she had to work with, and started improvising with the tools and spare parts she carried in the vest she wore over her uniform. A vest with so many pockets that new crew members sometimes assumed it was standard equipment and asked where to get one. And she rerouted the sensor feed through a secondary system that had not been touched since the Calliope's last dry dock 18 months ago. She used 2 zip ties, a piece of heat-resistant tape, and a soldering iron she kept in her left boot for reasons she had never fully explained to anyone. The secondary system came online at about 60% capacity. 60% in the Cassian Rift felt like a miracle. She keyed her comm. "Sensors back." "Mostly." Kowalski's voice came back. "Define mostly." "We can see far enough to not die, for now." "Good enough." On the observation station outside the rift, Quell Saras was receiving fragmented transmission bursts from the Calliope, partial data packets that the rift spat out occasionally before swallowing them again. The data was incomplete, but he had enough to understand what was happening inside, in broad strokes. He added more sentences to his document. He was now on page 4. He noted that the humans were afraid. This was not a conclusion he drew from data alone. He had spent enough time around them to read certain physical signals. The way Commander Kowalski stood with her weight slightly forward, like someone bracing for a blow that had not arrived yet. The way the engineer's transmissions came through clipped and fast, efficient in a way that signaled her mind was moving ahead of her words. The way even the fragments of navigation chatter from Marsh had a particular tightness to them, a controlled quality that was not the same as calm. They knew the odds, and they understood the danger as clearly as the Theron analysts who had calculated 91.3% from the safety of their chambers. They were not stopping. Quell Saras wrote, "Fear, in Theron philosophy, is a correct signal to cease action. In humans, it appears to function differently. I am not certain it functions as a signal at all. It may be a fuel." He read the sentence back. He left it in. Inside the rift, time moved strangely. Not literally. The clocks ran fine, but the quality of time changed, the way it does when every minute carries more weight than usual. The crew rotated in 2-hour shifts, not because protocol required it, but because Kowalski had made a quiet decision early on that exhaustion was the enemy she could actually control. She could not control the rift, so she could control whether her people had enough left in them to keep thinking. She sat with Marsh through 2 consecutive shifts. She did not navigate. That was his. She watched. She kept a second set of eyes on the screens and called out things she noticed before he did, and he adjusted, and they worked together in the specific silence of 2 people who have figured out how to be useful to each other without a lot of conversation. At some point during the 3rd hour, she realized he was singing. It was quiet, almost under his breath. An old country song, something with a slow tempo that had no business being the soundtrack to threading a debris corridor 20 meters wide. She didn't recognize the song. She didn't ask about it. The rest of the bridge crew didn't ask either. The singing just existed in the background of everything. Jan hurried, steady, and nobody said a word, because whatever it was doing for his concentration, it was working. The rift narrowed. There was a section. The Accord mapping data called it a transit corridor, which was the kind of label that assumed it still looked like a corridor. where the debris had compacted over the years into something closer to a wall with gaps. The gaps were real but irregular. Some were wide enough for the calliope with room to spare. Some were wide enough for the calliope if Marsh was exact to within 4 meters. One of them, the one that sat in the direct line to the thermal reading they were chasing, was wide enough if he was exact to within 2. He was exact to within 2. The ship moved through it without the hull touching anything. The clearance on the port side was close enough that a camera on that side of the ship captured a clean visual of a piece of old Velthari hull plating drifting past. Debris from some earlier accident, years old, still tumbling slowly in the rift's magnetic grip. And then the thermal imaging, running at 60% through Patel's repaired system, caught something. A ghost glow. Faint, partially masked by the debris field around it. But there, a heat signature that had the specific shape of a ship's engine core running on emergency power. The Sorrow of Stars. Still there. Still holding together, barely. And something else. A second signal, small and irregular, broadcasting on a Mindari probe frequency. The probe the hegemony had written off as lost 11 days ago was not dead. It was damaged. Sitting wedged against a chunk of debris, running a looped distress signal of its own on battery power that had to be almost gone. The Mindari had declared it lost. Nobody had come back for it. Kowalski looked at the probe signal for a moment. Then she looked at the Sorrow of Stars' thermal reading, which was still 11 minutes of careful navigation ahead of them. Then she looked at the probe again. 3-minute detour, she said. Marsh was already adjusting the heading. Quell Saris, receiving the fragmented data burst 20 minutes later, spent a long time with that particular piece of information. The humans had taken a detour inside a lethal debris field, and during a mission already operating at the edge of what was survivable, to recover a probe belonging to a civilization that had not sent a single ship to help with the rescue they were currently executing. He opened a new line in his document. He wrote, "Because we were in the neighborhood." He had gotten that phrase from a fragment of bridge audio, Kowalski's answer when the probe salvage query came through the comms log. He did not know what to do with this phrase either. He wrote it down anyway. He was writing down everything now because something was happening inside the Cassian Rift that he did not have existing vocabulary for, and he had the growing feeling that vocabulary was exactly what the Accord was going to need. The Calliope moved toward the Sorrow of Stars. The debris closed in around it on both sides. The Marsh kept singing. The Sorrow of Stars was still standing because of one woman's stubbornness and very precise math. Elder Cirrus Van had been the colony ship's record keeper before the accident, which meant her job in ordinary times was to log cargo manifests, crew rotations, and the kind of administrative data that nobody reads unless something goes wrong. When something went wrong, catastrophically, in the span of 4 hours 11 days ago, she became the person who kept the ship from collapsing into chaos. She did this not by being loud or forceful, but by being organized in a way that felt almost aggressive. She rationed food in calculations so precise they accounted for each person's body weight and metabolic rate. She organized work shifts around remaining power availability, in switching systems off in rotating cycles so that no single system drained the last reserves. She kept records of everything, every decision made, every system that failed, the exact time of each failure, because she had decided early on that someone was going to want to know what had happened here. She had not been certain the someone would arrive while she was still alive to tell them. When the proximity alarm went off, and the sensor team reported a small ship threading the outer debris field on what appeared to be an intercept course, the Sorrow of Stars went quiet for about 10 seconds. Then it got loud all at once. Voices, movement, children crying without fully knowing why, adults asking questions faster than anyone could answer. Cirrus Van stood in the center of the control room and let it run for those 10 seconds. And then she held up one hand. The ship went quiet again. "Wait," she said. "Let us see what it is first." What it was, it turned out, was the Calliope, a human ship, small and battered-looking, moving through the debris corridor with the specific careful patience of something that had been doing very difficult navigation for several hours. The breach seal request came through on emergency frequencies 2 minutes later. Docking protocols were followed. The airlock pressurized. The first human through the door was Nora Patel, carrying a toolkit in one hand and a sensor unit in the other, already looking at the wall panels with the expression of someone assessing damage before anyone has said hello. Behind her came 2 crew members with medical kits. Behind them came Commander Kowalski. Cirrus Van had communicated with humans before. Through diplomatic channels, through standard Accord language networks. She had never stood in the same room as one. She registered several things simultaneously, that Kowalski was not particularly tall, that she moved with the specific economy of someone who had long since stopped wasting energy on anything unnecessary, and that she looked tired. The deep kind of tired that settles into the face and stays there. Kowalski looked at Cirrus Van for a moment, then looked at the state of the ship around her. The dim emergency lighting, the cracked ceiling panels, the improvised repairs holding entire sections of wall together. "How many?" she said. 460, Cirrus Van said. "All alive." Something moved through Kowalski's expression too fast to fully read. "Okay," she said. Let's get them out." The evacuation was 4 hours long and it was not graceful. The Calliope was certified for a crew of 31. It was about to carry 490. Kowalski had done the math before entry. She had planned for it. But there is a difference between numbers on a screen and the physical reality of 460 Velthari, men, women, elderly, children, some injured, some barely walking, moving through corridors and into a ship that had been designed with entirely different assumptions in mind. Cargo bays became sleeping areas. Patel and 2 crew members moved through the Sorrow of Stars while the evacuation ran, doing emergency repairs to keep the dying ship's life support functional long enough to stay safe during the transfer, buying time in 2-hour increments, one system at a time. She was covered in coolant fluid and what appeared to be something orange from a broken emergency ration container by the end of the 2nd hour, and she had not slowed down at all. Marsh gave up his bunk without being asked, without commenting on it, and started sleeping in the navigation bay on a folded thermal blanket, which he arranged with the specific efficiency of someone who had clearly done this before. The children came through the airlock in small groups, shepherded by their parents and by crew members who had volunteered for the job. Most of them were quiet in the way children get quiet when the adults around them are tense. Some of them stared. Velthari children had never seen humans in person, only in images, in official Accord documentation, and in the kind of sanitized visual record that tells you what something looks like without telling you what it is. The humans were different from the images, more textured, noisier, warmer in a literal physical sense. Their body temperature ran higher than Velthari baseline. One child reached out and touched Cody Marsh's arm as he guided her group through the main corridor. She was maybe 4 years old, small even by Velthari standards, with the wide-set eyes of her species that made her look like she was permanently asking a question. She touched his arm with the precise, cautious interest of a scientist handling new material. He stopped. He looked down at her. He made a face, eyebrows up, mouth sideways, the specific ridiculous expression of an adult who has decided to be silly on purpose. She made a sound. Her mother made a sound. The Marsh realized a moment later that the sound was laughter, the first laughter on the Sorrow of Stars in 11 days. He made the face again. More children laughed. He kept walking them through the corridor. Cirrus Van watched this from the doorway of the control room, still holding the records she had been maintaining through 11 days of dying ship and empty emergency channels. She had continued adding to them even during the evacuation, time-stamping each entry, noting each person's safe passage through the airlock with the same precision she had applied to everything else. The record was nearly complete now. The number was going down. 460 minus each name she marked as through and safe, getting smaller in a direction that felt like something she did not have a word for yet. She found Kowalski near the end, when the last group was moving through. "Why did you come?" she asked. Her standard was slow, careful, the words chosen with the deliberateness of someone speaking in a second language. Kowalski was quiet for a moment, not dismissive, actually thinking about it, the way someone thinks about a question they have not been asked before in quite that way. "Because you asked," she said. Cirrus Van turned that over. In Velthari logic, need was not sufficient cause for action. You assessed your resources, your risk, your probability of success, and then you decided whether action was rational. If the numbers said no, you did not act. If the number said the mission was 91.3% likely to kill you, you did not act. This was not cruelty. It was mathematics. What Kowalski had said did not fit into that framework anywhere that Cirrus Van could find. She wrote it down anyway. At the bottom of her records, below the final name, below the timestamp of the last person through the airlock, she wrote it in Velthari and then tried to write it in Standard and found that it did not translate cleanly. The concept it pointed toward, the idea that asking was itself enough, that need was its own answer, existed in no Velthari linguistic structure she could locate. She would have to build one. The last person through the airlock was Cirrus Van herself. She carried her records in a physical storage unit held against her chest because she did not trust the backup copies. Kowalski was at the airlock door, and they looked at each other for a moment in the specific way two people look at each other when words are insufficient, and both of them know it. Then the airlock closed. Then the Calliope turned for the exit of the rift, carrying 490 souls, running on repairs held together by zip ties and tape and a soldering iron from an engineer's boot, and the ship that was never a rescue vessel began the long, careful work of becoming exactly that. The dot came back. At 1847 station time, the Calliope's transponder signal reappeared on the Accord navigation grid. A small blinking point emerging from the electromagnetic dark of the Cassian Rift's outer boundary, like something that had been told it was not supposed to exist and had come back anyway. The sensor team on the observation station logged it in silence. And then someone said something in Theron. Then someone else said something in Saravai. Then the diplomatic channels lit up all at once, 17 different frequencies, and the observation station became a very noisy place for a few minutes. Quell Sarah sat at his desk and looked at the dot and did not say anything. He had been awake for most of the past 2 days, adding to his document in the stretches between data fragments, trying to build a framework for what he was seeing in real time. He had 31 pages now. He had used the phrase, "I do not know what they are," 14 times. He had a section titled Notes on Fear as Fuel that he had started and stopped and restarted 3 times because he kept feeling that he was almost understanding something and then losing it. Now the dot was back. He ran the scan data as it came in. In the Calliope's hull temperature was elevated, consistent with a high-stress transit. Navigation array showing partial function. Life support systems running well above standard capacity. Mass reading significantly heavier than the ship's logged weight. He ran the mass reading twice, then a third time, 490 aboard. He opened a new paragraph and wrote, "They brought all of them." The Theron Honor Fleet had been dispatched the moment the signal was confirmed. 17 ships, gleaming and fully equipped, with medical personnel and proper triage facilities and all the resources the Accord had failed to mobilize when the resources might have mattered. They arrived 22 minutes after the Calliope cleared the rift boundary. 22 minutes. Quell Saris noted the number. He noted it carefully. Commander Kowalski's first communication with the incoming Theron fleet was brief. The Theron fleet commander offered assistance with triage, transfer, and medical assessment. His tone was formal and generous, the tone of someone extending a significant offer. Kowalski's response came back after a short pause, polite, clear, with the specific, careful word choice of someone who was choosing not to say several other things they could have said instead. She said they were welcome to assist now that the hard part was done. The fleet commander did not respond to that for several seconds. Then he confirmed receipt of the communication and began coordinating approach vectors. Pete Greer, still on the observation station, watched the Calliope receive the incoming fleet from his chair in the common area. He had a cup of coffee, and he had not slept much either. He watched the 17 ships arrange themselves around one very small, very damaged frigate, like an honor guard that had arrived late to the thing it was supposed to be guarding. Quell Saris came and sat across from him. "Did your people know they could do it?" the Theron asked. "Before they went in? Did they know they would come back out with survivors?" Greer thought about this for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think they knew." Quell Saris waited. "That's not really how it works," Greer added. Quell Saris waited some more. Greer drank his coffee. No further explanation came. The Theron official returned to his desk and wrote that sentence down. "That's not really how it works." He stared at it. He had no idea what it meant as a complete thought. He kept it anyway. He was keeping everything. And the Accord's formal response to the rescue arrived through diplomatic channels over the following 48 hours. There were commendations. There were carefully worded statements of admiration from the Saravai Collective, which had still not finished its ethics committee report when the Calliope emerged from the rift with everyone alive. There were formal acknowledgments from the Theron Directorate, noting that the human vessel had achieved an outcome that their own probability models had correctly assessed as highly unlikely. The Mindari hegemony sent nothing for 2 days. On the third day, a short communication arrived. It came directly to the Calliope, not to the Accord diplomatic network, not to a committee or an ambassador, but to Commander Kowalski personally. The Mindari did not issue formal statements through personal channels. It was not standard procedure. Quell Saris noted this in his document as a deviation without precedent in his 11 years of diplomatic observation. The message was 3 words in Mindari standard. The translation was approximate. Mindari grammar did not always map cleanly, but the version that circulated through the diplomatic community rendered it as, "We were wrong." No elaboration, no context, no specification of what exactly they had been wrong about, just the 3 words, which in Mindari culture apparently required considerable internal effort to produce because the hegemony was not in the habit of saying them at all. Quell Saris wrote the 3 words at the top of a new page. He looked at them for a while. Well, then he did something he had not planned to do. He requested permission to visit the Calliope in person. Permission was granted. He traveled across by shuttle, following the formal protocol for boarding a vessel of another species, wearing the full diplomatic designation marks that indicated he was there in an official observational capacity. A crew member named Kevin Bright met him at the airlock. Young, looked like he had been awake for a long time, carrying a cup of something hot that he offered to the Theron official with a kind of automatic, unthinking hospitality that Quell Saris noted and filed away. He moved through the ship. It was crowded in a way that the Calliope had clearly not been designed to be. Velthari were everywhere, sitting in corridors, sleeping in cargo bays on folded blankets, gathered in small clusters around nothing in particular, the quiet gathering of people who had survived something and had not yet fully processed what surviving it meant. Human crew members moved through and around them with the practiced efficiency of people managing an unusual situation by deciding it was simply the situation and getting on with it. He found Cody Marsh in the navigation bay, asleep on the floor on a folded thermal blanket, one arm across his face against the light. His bunk, Quelsaris learned from Kevin Bright, was currently occupied by a Velthari family of 6. Nobody had asked Marsh to give it up. He had just moved his blanket to the floor and apparently not thought about it since. Quelsaris stood in the doorway for a moment, and he wrote in his notes, "There is a behavior here that I cannot categorize under strategic generosity, social performance, or resource exchange. It appears to be neither. I do not have a category for what it is." The document was 47 pages now. He presented it to the Accord Council 3 weeks later, standing at the center of the council chamber in front of representatives from all 5 founding species and the human delegation, who sat in the back row and looked slightly uncomfortable with all the attention. He had titled the document, "The Irrational Calculus of Human Response," which was the most honest title he could find, because irrational was the only technically accurate word for decision-making that consistently ignored the numbers and consistently produced outcomes the numbers said were impossible. And he read them the passage about fear as fuel. He read them the passage about the probe salvage, because we were in the neighborhood. He read them, at the end, the 3 words from the Mindari. The council chamber was quiet for a while after that. The kind of quiet that happens when a room full of intelligent beings is trying to rebuild something in their thinking. In the back row, Pete Greer drank his coffee. 6 months after the Calliope came out of the rift, the Galactic Accord changed its rules. The change was small. If you read through the full Emergency Response Protocol, which was a very long document that most people never read in full, it was barely a paragraph in the middle of Section 7. The old clause had allowed any member civilization to formally decline a distress call if their assessed mission loss probability exceeded a threshold they considered unacceptable. The threshold had been set at 70%. In practical terms, this meant that the more dangerous the rescue, the more correct it was to walk away. The math said so. The protocol said the math was right. The new paragraph removed that clause entirely. There was debate before the vote. There is always debate. Several Theron Council members argued reasonably that removing the clause could not change physics. Dangerous missions would still kill ships, and no wording in any protocol document made anyone harder to kill. They were not wrong about this. The debate went on for several sessions. In the end, the vote passed. The clause was removed, and nobody named it at the official session. Informally, in diplomatic circles and academy hallways and the kind of conversations that happen over meals in the weeks after a significant vote, people called it the Kowalski Amendment. The name spread the way informal names spread. Nobody decided it. It just became the thing people said. By the time it reached Kowalski herself, it had already been the Kowalski Amendment for about 3 weeks. She sent back the commemorative plaque that the Velthari Council had commissioned and shipped to her current posting. The note she included was handwritten, polite, and specific. She said the crew had already received something better. She did not say what. The plaque commission asked the Accord liaison to inquire further. The Accord liaison asked Pete Greer, who asked Kowalski directly. She thought about it for a moment in the way she thought about things she hadn't been asked before in quite that way. "They laughed," she said finally. "The kids on the Sorrow of Stars. Marsh made a face and they laughed. And that was the first time in 11 days. That's what we got. That's the thing." Greer passed this back through the chain. Nobody knew exactly what to do with it. Quelsaris, when he heard it, added it to the document. It was 63 pages now. The ceremony on Velth happened on the 6-month anniversary. The Velthari homeworld had been rebuilt over a generation, slowly, carefully, with the specific patience of people who had learned from disaster what was actually worth building back. The ceremony hall was large and full of light. And outside the windows, the city moved with the ordinary rhythm of 460 people who had come home, and their families who had spent 11 days not knowing, and a community that had quietly rearranged itself around their return, the way a living thing grows back around a wound. Cirrus Van stood at the front with her records in her hands. She had maintained them through everything. Through the rift, through the transfer, through the months of settlement and reconstruction, adding to them as things developed, keeping the timeline intact. She was a record keeper by training and by nature. The records were what she had. She read the names, all 460 of them in the order she had written them down, yet in the precise tone of someone who understood that each name was not a symbol but a specific person with a specific face who had been alive and scared and then had been moved, one at a time, through an airlock by people who had come from far away and had not asked whether coming was rational. The hall was quiet the entire time she read. When she reached the end of the names, she read the timestamps. The time the first system failed, the time the life support dropped to 14%, the time the Calliope's docking seal locked. Then she read the time the last person crossed the airlock. Then she read the word she had invented. She said it first in Velthari, which she spoke with the ease of a person using their first language for something it was made for. Then she tried to explain what it meant in Standard, which took longer, because Standard did not have it. She said that she had been looking for an existing word and had not found one anywhere in the Accord's shared linguistic database. She said the concept it pointed toward was the kind of help that doesn't ask whether to help first. The hall was still quiet. Several linguists who had been consulted in the weeks before the ceremony had proposed different standard approximations. Most of them were too long. Some were accurate, but cold. One of them, an academic from the Saravai Collective who had spent the previous month studying the word and its cultural construction, had submitted a proposal that was simply human. He noted in his submission that this was not a definition, but a reference. That calling something human, in the context of the ceremony and the story it was anchoring, would carry the meaning without requiring explanation. That meaning built from event was sometimes stronger than meaning built from definition. The Accord Linguistic Committee had not formally adopted his proposal. But it circulated anyway, the way the Kowalski Amendment had circulated, and within a few months it had settled into the specific informal usage the way words do when they fit something that needed fitting. The Calliope was decommissioned that same month. Standard procedure. Too many compromised systems, the hull stress from the Rift transit logged in the engineering assessment as beyond cost-effective repair. The decommissioned paperwork was filed and processed, and the ship was scheduled for recycling in the normal course of things. Nora Patel submitted a request for the data core. No one asked why. The data core was not a valuable piece of equipment. It was logging hardware that kept records of the ship's systems. Engine data, navigation history, maintenance logs, standard archive material. Nobody thought to question the request. They cleared it and had the core shipped to her new posting. It sat on her desk. She did not display it dramatically. She did not mount it on a wall or put a label on it. She just put it on the corner of her desk the way people put things they want to be able to see, and left it there. Cody Marsh got a new assignment 3 months after the decommission. A navigation posting on a larger vessel, a promotion that his commanding officer had been trying to give him for over a year. He accepted it without much ceremony. On his first day aboard the new ship, he did the thing he always did. He stood in the navigation bay and listened. He listened to the engine hum, the particular vibration of the life support cycling, the way the ship settled and creaked in the small ways that every ship does. He learned its sounds the way you learn the sounds of a place you are going to live. He named nothing. He just listened. Kowalski took a shore posting. 8 months, teaching navigation at a joint Accord Human Academy, where students from 6 species sat in the same classrooms and learned the same equations. She was not a natural teacher in the theatrical sense. She did not pace dramatically, she did not give speeches, she did not have the kind of personality that fills a room. What she had was the quality of someone who had seen what the equations actually meant when applied to something real, and that quality came through whether she was trying to project it or not. On the first day of each new class, She asked the same question. What is the most important thing to learn? The students gave different answers. Some were technical. Some were philosophical. Some tried to guess what answer she wanted and gave back a version of what they thought she had already decided. She listened to all of them and said nothing until they were done. Then she went to the board and wrote one sentence. She wrote it in Standard because Standard was the only language all of them shared, and she wrote it in lowercase letters without emphasis, the way you write something that does not need emphasis because it carries its own weight. She wrote, "The math is not the mission." Then she sat down and started the class. And the students copied it into their notes. They argued about what it meant for years, in dormitory hallways, in late-night study sessions, in the kinds of conversations that happen between people who are training to go out into space and are still figuring out what they actually believe about it. Some of them thought it meant the numbers were not important. Some of them thought it meant the numbers were one part of a larger thing. Some of them thought it was specifically about the rift, about the calliope, about what 91.3% had and had not predicted. Most of them kept it. Long after the class ended, long after the academy, in postings across the Accord's known space, on ships of 6 different species and a dozen more, they kept it. Written in notebooks, saved in personal logs, I scratched into the corner of navigation consoles when nobody was looking. Not because they were sure what it meant, because they had the feeling, which was stronger than certainty, that it meant something true.